Okay, moving on to our digestive system. Pretty big lecture. We're going to cover a lot of different organs, as you can see here in this illustration. And some of these organs we've talked about before. Some of them will be absolutely brand new to us. The groups of organs that make up our digestive system can be grouped into kind of two categories. What we call the GI tract, which I've mentioned at many points in the semester, short for gastrointestinal tract. It includes the mouth all the way down to the very end of your large intestine. So obviously the mouth and large intestine are included, but also the pharynx, most of which, anyway, not the entire pharynx. Your esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, and then the large intestine, as I mentioned. Now the term, I don't really use it very often, is the alimentary canal. But this is just a continuous tube extending from our mouth to the anus through our thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. Length of the GI tract is about 5 to 7 meters or 16.5 to 23 feet in a living person. And I say a living person because it actually can grow after you die because of the loss of muscle contraction in the tract, so it will actually extend out if the person wants to pull out. Most of the length of your tract comes from the small intestine, which is folded tremendously back and forth, front to back, like we see here in our picture. Your large intestine also sees some kind of folding. What that increases is the amount of surface area available for digesting and absorbing the nutrients that we get from our food and beverages. Obviously, no person is 16.5 to 23 feet in length. So it's not just a straight shot from the mouth to the anus. There's a lot of twisting and turning going on. Now, in this picture, we also show, and I guess that's why they colored those red, what we call the accessory digestive organs, which include your teeth and your tongue found in your mouth, salivary glands that are associated with our mouth, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Those don't directly do any digesting. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that because your teeth and tongue play a role in digestion. But they're not part of the tract as far as, like a tube goes. They are connected to it, or like in the case of our teeth and tongue, found within the mouth. But your liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are very, very important as well and connected to it by way of some ducts. The tract itself contains food from the time it's eaten to the time it's digested and absorbed or then eliminated. Muscular contractions in the wall of our GI tract physically break down food by churning it and propelling it along the tract from our esophagus to the anus. The contractions also help dissolve food by mixing them with fluids secreted in the tract. The enzymes secreted by these accessory digestive organs and cells that line our tract break down our food chemically, which is one of the functions of our digestive system I have listed here on this page. Okay, the first function is the first thing we do with food and drinks, which is ingestion. Fancy way to describe eating, taking food and liquids into our mouth. Right away we begin mixing that food and drink with chemicals that we secrete. Secretion, you can see, is number 2. Each day, cells within our walls of the GI tract and the accessory digestive organs secrete a total of about 7 liters of chemicals into the lumen of the tract. 7 liters, think about that. That's, 3.5 big pop bottles of chemicals. Most of that chemical is water. Also includes acids, or an acid, not acids, buffers, and then lots and lots of enzymes, which help with digestion. Okay. The third function of a digestive system is to mix and perform propulsion. Mixing and propulsion is done through alternating contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscles in the walls of our tract, which helps mix the food and secretions and helps to propel the food toward the anus. The capacity of our GI tract to mix and move material along its length is called motility. And digestion is where food is broken down into smaller subunits, i.e. proteins are broken down into amino acids. And we do this because we can't absorb the big complex organic compounds like proteins, but we can absorb the small, simple amino acids. The very first type of digestion begins in our mouth when we chew, bite into that food. That's a form of mechanical digestion. It also continues in the smooth muscles of or thanks to the smooth muscle of our stomach and small intestine. Key with mechanical digestion is a physical breakdown, meaning we take a big piece of food and we make it smaller. Taking something big and making it smaller is not involving chemical reactions, which is what chemical digestion involves. Chemical digestion involves hydrolysis. Remember back at the beginning of the semester, we learned hydrolysis was where you break bonds, taking something like AB and breaking it down to A plus B. This is what's taking place in chemical digestion, where there's enzymes involved, taking large carbohydrates like starches and breaking them down into glucose molecules, or those amino acids are split from bigger chains of amino acids, and so on and so forth. Why do we do that? And I already mentioned it, is because we can't absorb the large complex organic compounds, but we can absorb those small, much simpler things like glucose and amino acids. Absorption is the whole reason we eat and drink. Sure, we eat and drink because we're hungry and we're thirsty and we enjoy the taste of stuff, but it's not the real root of why we need to eat and drink. Okay. Absorption is the entrance of ingested and secreted fluids, ions, and other products of digestion into the epithelial cells that line our lumen of the GI tract, where they then typically pass into our bloodstream, or in some cases our lymph. Then they can circulate to our cells throughout the body. Only molecules that are absorbed actually enter our body, because wastes remain in the intestinal lumen and are considered outside the body. So it's kind of weird to think of it this way, but the breakfast that you ate this morning, probably still in your stomach and now moving into your small intestines. That food that's still inside the tract is technically still outside of us. Because at that point, or at this point, it's really not doing anything specific for us, other than just keeping us from being hungry again. Until it enters through the wall of the tract into the blood, it's not part of the body. Okay. What does not enter the body through the wall of our intestinal tract or stomach ends up being pushed out in the form of feces, the process we call defecation. This includes waste, indigestible substances, bacteria, cells that are sloughed off from the lining of the tract, and digestive materials that we just didn't get absorbed. This goes out through the anus, once again in the form of feces. As always, I like to include a little bit of anatomy as we roll through the lecture so that we can understand structure as it affects function. We'll do that here on this page, talking a little bit about the tract itself and its structural makeup. From our lower esophagus, which is down there toward your stomach, all the way down to the anal canal, our wall of the GI tract has a pretty basic, same arranged makeup. 4 layers deep, shown here on the next page. The layers are a mucosa, which is the innermost layer, surrounded by a submucosa. The third is the muscularis, and then the very outer is the serosa, each of which plays a very important role in digestion, okay, and absorption and other functions. Okay. Mucosa is the inner lining of the GI tract, and is actually a 3-layered structure, so it's got 3 sublayers. It is a mucous membrane, so there's mucus obviously produced in very, very high quantities. We find exocrine cells throughout the mucosa that secrete this mucus and other fluids into the lumen of the tract. There's also endocrine cells that secrete hormones that regulate digestion, as we'll talk about in various parts of the lecture. We also find a lot of blood and lymphatic vessels within the mucosa, and this is where that absorbed set of stuff will end up going as it's picked up by our body from the tract. Surrounding the mucosa is a submucosa, layer of areolar connective tissue binding the mucosa to the muscularis. We find many blood and lymphatic vessels that also receive absorbed food molecules. Associated with our submucosa is a network of neurons that we call our submucosal plexus, which are a component of our enteric nervous system that I'm going to talk about here on the next page, or on this page because I'm already on it. Surrounding the submucosa is a muscularis, which contains muscle, hence the name. What type of muscle is kind of unique depending on where you're at. In our mouth, the pharynx, and the superior middle parts of the esophagus, there's skeletal muscle. In the rest of the tract, it's smooth. Now, we haven't talked a lot about smooth muscle this semester, although we've mentioned it at various points. But thinking back to our muscle lecture, we talked about the fact that skeletal muscle has typically voluntary control. We have voluntary control over it. Whereas smooth muscle is like cardiac muscle, and then it's involuntarily controlled. What do we use our mouth for when it comes to the digestive system? Your mouth, your pharynx, and your esophagus are very involved with swallowing, something that begins as a voluntary process, and then when that food enters our stomach, it's all completely involuntary. That's because the end of our esophagus is strictly made up of smooth muscle. Once that food has made its way into our stomach, do we ever have to do anything with it voluntarily? No. Okay. That's because smooth muscle is controlled involuntarily. And that smooth muscle is controlled by another plexus, what we call a myenteric plexus, a network of neurons that controls the contraction and relaxation of that muscle. Now, there's, in most places of our tract, 2 layers of smooth muscle, an inner sheet of circular fibers and an outer sheet of longitudinal fibers, meaning that they run it perpendicular to one another. In our stomach, where we do a lot of mixing and twirling and swirling the food around, there's actually 3 layers of muscle, and so our stomach can really squeeze and contract and relax and do all sorts of kind of cool stuff. The very outer layer of the tract, really physiologically is not that important to us, is a serosa, serous membrane made up of areolar connective tissue and simple squamous. It does just like what most other outer layers of structures do, kind of holds the organs in place. Okay, let's talk about the enteric nervous system I was mentioning, and we mentioned way back in our lecture when we introduced the nervous system, we learned is a division of our nervous system that aids in digestion. Neurons of the enteric nervous system include the myenteric plexus that I was just talking about, controlling GI tract motility. Motility, remember, is the ability of our tract to contract and move stuff along, mix it up as well. And then there's the submucosal plexus, which is involved with controlling the glands of our different parts of the tract. Okay, glands like that we show here that secrete substances into the lumen of the tract to help with digestion. Okay. So our submucosal plexus controls secretions of these organs of the GI tract. In this case, this will be small intestine, but we'd see the same thing if that was a picture of the stomach or the large intestine. Our plexuses of the enteric nervous system are going to consist of motor neurons, interneurons, and sensory neurons, just like we learned back at the beginning of that nervous system lecture, nervous tissue lecture. The sensory neurons of the enteric nervous system function as chemoreceptors or stretch receptors. Chemoreceptors, which we just talked about, like in our respiratory system, respond to chemical changes. In this case, like when food hits our stomach, the chemical concentration of our stomach changes, especially like the pH of our stomach. So we're monitoring that, and we're monitoring the stretch of stuff like our stomach. Because as we know, when we fill our stomach up with food, what happens to the wall of the stomach? It stretches, right? Okay. So the arrival of food into our stomach, for example, changes the pH inside of it and changes the stretch, the shape of the stomach. We send signals into the interneurons. Remember, interneurons are between sensory and motor neurons. Inter means between. Interneurons, as you can see here, connect or interconnect the neurons of our mesenteric and submucosal plexuses. And then we activate motor neurons, which are going to send signals out to the muscles to cause them to contract. Thanks to the mesenteric plexus, the motor neurons from the submucosal plexus also cause secretions of the GI tract. So the arrival of food into our stomach causes it to stretch, causes it to change its pH, which starts to activate the stomach to start doing what it needs to do. Contracting, mixing that stuff up with the stuff it's secreting, which is the other major thing that's doing. Although neurons of our enteric nervous system can function independently, they are subject to regulation by neurons of our autonomic nervous system. Talked about this previously. We know the parasympathetic produces that rest and digest response, which is great for digestion because rest and digest literally tells you that parasympathetic is going to promote and increase secretion activity because it stimulates the ENS. Whereas, and we've talked about this, when our fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system is active, we need to kind of dedicate everything we can to that fight or flight response. So essentially, we shut down digestion, demonstrated there by it's saying sympathetic stimulation decreases secretion and activity by inhibiting the ENS. Okay, really quick, I want to talk about gastrointestinal reflexes. Many neurons of our enteric nervous system are components of GI reflexes or GI reflex pathways that regulate GI secretion and motility in response to stimuli present in the lumen of our tract. Initial components of a typical GI reflex pathway are sensororeceptors, those I just talked about, chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors, associated with those sensory neurons of the ENS. Axons of these sensory neurons can synapse with other neurons located in the ENS, the CNS, or the ANS. Enteric nervous system, central nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, informing these regions about the nature of the contents and the degree of distension or stretching of the tract. Neurons of our ENS, CNS, or ANS subsequently activate or inhibit GI glands and smooth muscle, which alters the secretion of those organs and the ability of them to contract and move. If a reflex pathway is confined entirely within our GI tract wall, we call it a short reflex. It involves not only the GI tract wall, but also the CNS and autonomic nerves. We call it a long reflex. I could get into a lot more detail about reflexes when it comes to the digestive system, but I just kind of wanted to introduce that there are some, and I'm not going to go into more detail than that. With that said, what we're going to do from this point for the next several slides is go from the top of the tract all the way down, where it all begins with the mouth, also known as your oral or buccal cavity, formed by the cheeks, the hard and soft palates, and your tongue. Associated with our mouth are salivary glands. We have them both inside our mouth, within the oral mucosa, but we have kind of more important ones located outside the mouth that have ducts that carry the secretions of saliva into the oral cavity. Okay. Ordinarily, we secrete just enough saliva to keep our mouth and pharynx moist and clean, but when food enters our mouth, we increase our secretions to help lubricate, dissolve, and actually begin chemical digestion. Secretion of saliva is just called salivation. It's a parasympathetic nervous system response. Should be pretty common sense there. Our salivary glands are accessory organs of digestion lying outside the mouth and releasing their secretions into ducts that empty in the oral cavity. Just said that already. These include a pair of parotid glands, which are kind of in your cheeks, submandibular glands that are located kind of underneath your jawline, and sublingual glands that are right underneath your tongue. Now, your tongue, speaking of, actually contains glands called lingual glands, containing a secretion of both mucus and a watery serous fluid, containing an enzyme called lingual lipase. As far as saliva goes, it's way predominantly water, 99.5% water, but then there's 0.5% of stuff dissolved in it, and there's a lot actually dissolved in it. Ions of sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, chloride, and phosphate, dissolved gases, various organic substances, urea, uric acid, mucus, immunoglobulin A, that's one of those antibodies that we previously learned about. Lysozyme, one of those chemicals we also talked about that kills bacteria. Lingual lipase that I just mentioned, and then another enzyme called salivary amylase. The water in our saliva helps dissolve foods so they can be tasted. We talked about that back in that lecture on sensations. But also saliva helps with beginning digestion inside the mouth. And bicarbonate and phosphate ions in our saliva help buffer acidic foods that enter our mouth. So saliva is only slightly acidic, having a pH just under 7, 6.35 to 6.85. Mucus in our saliva is very important because it helps lubricate the food and make it more easily swallowed in the form of what we call a bolus, which is a mass of food and saliva mixed together, which is the mass that we swallow. Okay. I'm going to stop right here. It's 10:50. We'll finish the rest of the slide on Wednesday and pick up right there after. Sound good?